There it goes. All right, so now we're recording. So hopefully this will be an opportunity for other directors in Catholic Charities and parish ambassadors to utilize this, the recording that we're doing for the webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. And so what I'd like to do is just start with a quick prayer before we move into the presentations. And this comes from our National Catholic Rural Life Conference. So let us pray for the poor, hungry, and neglected all over the world, that their cries for daily bread may inspire works of compassion and mercy among those whom much has been given. Let us pray for the farmers with limited and marginal land throughout the world, for those who lack access to water and other resources, and for the light of research and support services to shine in the lives of all God's people. Let us pray for the health of women, children, and families around the world, especially for an end to maternal and child mortality, that in building healthy families, all God's people may be empowered to strengthen their communities and repair the breaches which divide nations and peoples. Let us pray for an end to the waste and desecration of God's creation, for access to the fruits of creation to be shared equally among all people, and for communities and nations to find sustenance in the fruits of the earth and the water God has given us. Let us pray for all the nations and people who already enjoy the abundance of creation and the blessings of prosperity, that their hearts may be lifted up to the needs of the poor and afflicted, and partnerships between rich and poor for the reconciliation of the world may flourish and grow. Lord, hear our prayer. Amen. So I want to real quick put the context or the webinar in context. For the Catholic Charities Diocese of Cleveland, one of our strategic priorities is to elevate advocacy. And this is an opportunity for the Diocesan Social Action Office to start doing that and to start being able to engage all Catholic Charities employees and hopefully diocesan employees and parishes in the role that we have to be a voice for those who don't have a voice. The webinar today is supposed to provide a foundation to help us better understand why it's important for us to respond to legislation, particularly around the Farm Bill, and to provide that education so that when you see an action alert, you understand the context that it's in. It's also for us to be a voice for our clients in Catholic Charities and a voice for the farmers that we have in Ohio. And just to let you know how the Farm Bill could have the potential to impact us, we served over 500,000 people last year across all the Catholic Charities programs. The Catholic Hunger and Shelter Network provided over 3 million meals through the food pantries, hot meal programs, and shelters, and that does not necessarily include the parish. Include parish food pantries and other services that St. Vincent de Paul Society is providing. So you can see that over 500,000 people and over 3 million people just in Northeast Ohio alone can be impacted by this Farm Bill. We also want to be sure that we're not leaving out the farmers that we have in Northeast Ohio and that they are impacted by this as well. So I'd like to go ahead and get started so that we stay on time. So the first person up is Andrew Baschan. Oh gosh, Andrew, I'm so sorry. Baschantic. Bosjantic. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over to turn the screen over to him and let him go ahead and give his presentation. That should be coming to you right now.
Okay.
Oh, you're up.
All right. Me. This one moment here. I'll make this.
And while you're doing that, Andrew, if you have any questions, please just type them in the chat box. So I haven't muted everybody's microphone, but if you would just put any questions in, and I'll make sure that those get asked.
Great. Well, first off, thank you for having me and letting me share with you a little bit about the Farm Bill. Once again, my name is Andrew Bosch-Jancic. I'm the Senior Manager for Social Policy over here at Catholic Charities USA. So I guess to share a little bit about the Farm Bill, it was signed into law, the current Farm Bill, in February of 2014. We're close to the authorization expiring in September. Currently, we have two versions of the Farm Bill that are going through the House and the Senate. The Senate just went through markup yesterday, and so they're expecting a vote next week. So the Farm Bill itself, it really takes a look at 12 titles. So farm commodity revenue, farm credit, trade, agriculture, research, rural development, energy, and a lot of domestic and international pieces. What I'm going to focus on today is a lot of the nutrition components of the Farm Bill. You can see here a breakdown of just a lot of the different programs: food distribution on Indian reservations, the TFAP program, which is for FY17 was $316 million. That really is what the support is for a lot of our food banks. It serves as kind of the backbone of the funding that they're able to receive. The Commodity Supplemental Food Program, which primarily focuses on seniors, and 39 states are participating, and that's $236 million. And you can see a list of the other programs here, but particularly for us, what we're going to focus on a lot is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or food stamps, as a lot of folks have known it, just because you can see here, this is the big kahuna of all of the programs. It's $70.9 billion in annual costs, so it by far is the largest piece of the Farm Bill. It takes up approximately 80% of the Farm Bill funding is related to SNAP. Here, so just a little bit of who qualifies and kind of the breakdown of what the program looks like. So who is eligible? You have to meet a certain criteria to qualify for SNAP. If your monthly income is below 130% of the poverty line, which is about $26,600 for a family of three. There is asset limits, so you have to have below $2,250. And that's without elderly or disabled members, so your car, other assets are counted against you for that. A lot of people who are not eligible for SNAP end up being most college students. They might meet the asset piece and the gross income piece, but being in college, they're typically ineligible. A lot of migrants and undocumented immigrants, which is something we continually see as folks telling us undocumented immigrants are receiving these benefits. So it's one of those things that we have to constantly reiterate, is they're actually not eligible for these benefits, and oftentimes they're not receiving them, but they are receiving other assistance that's not SNAP related. So the other thing we like to focus on is kind of how much does somebody on SNAP receive. So on average, it's about $125 per month, and which really breaks down to $4.15 a day. So if you can imagine what, trying to get enough food on the table at $4.15 a day, it is a struggle for a lot of the clients we see every single day. Down here is a little bit of a breakdown of the SNAP benefits, kind of by the household size. As you can see, the maximum benefit has increased. So as the household size increases, the benefit increases, but not at the same rate. So it slowly declines a little bit as your household size increases. So a question we constantly talk about is, how long can somebody be on SNAP? So as it currently stands, there isn't a time limit if you qualify. Now there's a big exception here. You have to still meet general work requirements. If you're considered what's an able-bodied worker, or ABOD, you have some additional work requirements. But there are a lot of folks who are exempt from the work requirement. Children, obviously, the elderly, disabled, and caretakers of disabled individual, or parents with a child under 6 years old. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what are work requirements. So generally, you have to register to work. You you have to participate in an education and training workforce program, or ENT. You have to accept suitable employment if you're offered it, so you can't just decline employment to stay on the program, and you can't voluntarily quit or reduce your work hours. Able-bodied ABODs, as I'll just go forward calling them, they're limited to 3 months of SNAP unless they meet specific work requirements. So this applies to individuals who are between 18 and 49. A few of the bills currently out there are trying to adjust a lot of the work requirements, but we'll just focus on what the current law stands. Are they fit for employment? They don't live in a SNAP household with a minor, not pregnant, not already exempt from a general work requirement, and they're not covered by the time limit waiver or 15% exemption, which is essentially the state can apply for if their caseload is less than the 15% exemption, they can add on another 15%. And then the work requirements you see requires to participate in a work program at least 20 hours per week, and it's averaged out monthly. So if you have 18 hours 1 week, but you have 22, it eventually, as long as it gets out to 20 hours per week, you're okay. And then you have to participate and comply with the workfare program as well. So when we look at SNAP, we want to see kind of, where is the bulk of folks that are receiving SNAP. So you can see here from this map, it has generally, there's a lot of like darker areas in the South, going up through Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia. It touches bits of Ohio and Pennsylvania as well. And we can kind of see here that a lot of these households are the ones that are particularly affected and impacted. Particularly also you can see some Texas and the Midwest, parts of California and the Pacific Northwest as well. So here's kind of the breakdown. So we see that these are the households and where they live, but what does that look like? So there are currently 21.8 million households that are receiving SNAP. The majority of them are children, elderly, or have disabilities. 32% of these households had jobs. 55% of households with children had earnings. And then 20% had no income of any time in a month when the data was collected. So 80% had income when we talk about, folks that are receiving these benefits. It's always good to highlight that a lot of them they're working, they're receiving income. They're not just receiving the benefit without participating in as far as work and receiving income. A little bit about the demographic breakdown. You can see here, nearly 40% of SNAP participants are white, 25% are African American, about 11% are Hispanic, 2.4% are Asian, and then 1% are Native American. And you can kind of see the breakdown that by area. So metro area is 12.6%, and I think a lot of times when we talk about SNAP, I think people frame it in the sense that it's happening. This is occurring in big cities. It's occurring, in the New York, Chicago, DCs are some of the bigger metro areas where they're the primary receivers. But you can see here that actually they're only getting 12.6%, and it's actually more of the small town households and the rural households that each make up about a little over 15% are the ones participating in the program. So the important question is, does the program work? What is the impact of SNAP? So you can see here 10% of SNAP households are moving above the poverty line when receiving SNAP. They, when their children have access to SNAP, they fare far better here. You can see that folks that are receiving SNAP they're able to improve their own adequate food. So they're receiving where their children are food insecure. If they're on SNAP, they're able to improve upon that going forward. And you can kind of see here that the children, are receiving a greater outcome. So their high school completion is up 18%, obesity is down, heart disease is down, stunted growth is down. So it's certainly, as far as the health impacts go, you can kind of see that there's no question about how the impact of SNAP is helping a lot of folks in these communities. And as we're kind of talking about SNAP and the Farm Bill and what the impact is, it's important to realize that, in most states, the program kind of moves as the economy moves. So as we were in the Great Recession, we saw a spike in SNAP. And now as the economy has improved, we're seeing that most caseloads in states are falling across the country. As I've kind of mentioned before, SNAP is really about a lot of folks that are actually working and participating in work programs. So 4 out of 5 participants don't have to work because they're eligible as, like I said, children, elderly, and disabled. They're the vast majority of those receiving it, but those folks that have those disqualifications still have folks in their households working. And you can kind of see from the chart here that 14% are currently employed, and then 19% aren't, but look most of the time looking for work. And then kind of, when we talk a little bit about SNAP, it's important to talk about the benefits cliff. So a lot of programs, if you reach a certain threshold of income, you're dropped off the program altogether. But as you can see here, SNAP kind of gradually, as you improve upon your income and your work situation, you receive less of the benefit until you're at a point where you no longer need it. So you can kind of see here from 0%, the benefit is higher. And then once you reach 130%, the benefit is a fraction of what you were receiving in the beginning. So then that way, nobody who, as they improve their work situation, is completely cut off from the program. And lastly, I just want to touch a little bit about TFAP is the other program that we talked about. It was established in 1981. So it provides supplement to low-income families by purchasing food commodities and sending them to states, state distributing agencies. So each state it varies based on the number of people with incomes below the poverty line. What states then do is they distribute food to the local pantries and food banks. So as I said earlier, this is kind of the backbone for food pantries as a way that they're able to receive their support to actually provide for the need in their communities. And then, so almost 20% of all the food in food banks comes from the TFAP program. And you can see at the last point here, TFAP purchases gives farmers an average of 20 cents per dollar when the purchase is made to support agricultural markets versus 16% for other purchases. And so I wanted last few minutes here just kind of touch a little bit about Ohio and a little bit about what SNAP looks like in Ohio. So you can kind of see here that 1.5 Ohio residents, or 13% of the population, 1 in 8, receive SNAP. Now that's, as I said earlier, 42 million in the United States, so 13% of the total population. So it's about the same as state population to total population. But what you can see below here is that more than 66% of SNAP participants are in families with children, which is right around the average nationally. 36% of families with are in families with members who are elderly or have disabilities, so it's a tad higher. And then you can see here that more than 43% are in working families, which is about the average as well. One thing to keep reiterating is folks that are receiving SNAP, they're at the poverty line, they're below the poverty line. So the income is typically about 51 to 100% of the poverty line here, which makes up nearly half of the entire list. And then so incomes that are at or below 50% of the poverty line makes up about 36%. And there's only a small fraction that are actually above 50%. That's 17%. So states can apply for those waivers to increase that limit as well, to allow folks that are in need to kind of manage what the state issues are, the state outcome is, so the state's allowed to have that flexibility to decide what rate folks would be eligible for poverty. So you can see here, many folks in Ohio are struggling to put food on the table. The data shows that nearly 15% of households were food insecure. The median income is 3% below the 2007 level after adjusting for inflation. So just prior to the Great Recession, you can see there hasn't been a full recovery. We're still trying to recover in Ohio. And then the last one I just want to highlight is kind of SNAP reaches needy populations. 80% of eligible individuals participated in the program. in 2015, and 77% of eligible workers participated. So it kept 419,000 people out of poverty in Ohio between 2009 and 2012. And then just a little bit on the average benefits by demographic. In Ohio, you can see here that all households receive about $248. With children, that number increases to $416. Households with seniors, unfortunately, only $111 of benefits. So you can kind of see that the average benefit for each household is approximately $123. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done as far as improving the SNAP program and the Farm Bill. But we're hopeful that with what's going on in the House and the Senate, that we're going to continue to work to make sure that folks are receiving the necessary nutrition that they need. And so with that, I'm going to pass it on over to Eric over at CRS. Eric, are you there?
I am here. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Andrew.
All right.
Appreciate it. All right. Let me get you switched over. Eric, where is he? There's Eric. Okay. All right. Well, we're switching over to Eric. Are there any questions for Andrew? Okay. Know that if you afterwards, if you do have any questions, you can always email me, Diane Zabaznik, at and I can find out the answer for you. So with that, we will pass this on to Eric Garduño, right?
Garduño, yes.
Garduño.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, folks. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm Eric Garduño. I'm with Catholic Relief Services, part of the advocacy team. My main role is to interface with Congress and the administration on a variety of policy issues. Top for me, though, and pertinent for our conversation today, is food security. And the Farm Bill actually is pretty important for international food security, and that's what I'm going to cover real quick here. So I'm going to jump in. My controls don't seem to, there we go. They're a little sticky. So just to give you a quick overview of where we come from as an organization, Catholic Relief Services looks at the people we're trying to help, small farm families around the developing world, in sort of three main categories. There are some in this graph sort of lays it out. On the recover side, these are people who are seeing recurring droughts, suffering recurring shocks in some way, have very little land, very little resources, very little hope, really, in a lot of cases. Some of them are dealing with conflict in their country that's keeping them away from being able to grow food. And so we put them in the recover category, where we're really just trying to keep them alive and get them to a point where they can have some stability in their life and start producing food for themselves. Now, in the build section, we're talking about people who have there's a little bit more stability to work with. We have people with a few acres of land, perhaps, maybe a goat or chickens or something like that, so something to work with. And there we spend more time on the development side of things, sort of basic development, providing services, teaching new ways to manage things on their farms. And then this rebalance section here, they're still subject to, unfortunately, shocks. And so if a drought comes by, that might put them behind of where they were, say, this year. And we're looking at mechanisms and ways to keep them from sliding all the way back down to the recover phase and come right back to where they were if they are impacted negatively by a shock. And then on the growth side of things, the types of assistance that we're doing there is with people who have 5 or more acres. They've been engaged in the market for a while in some perhaps limited capacity, and we're trying to bring them to the next level. In all cases here, we are looking at small farm families, poor families who are trying to make a living. It's just I guess a degree on how poor we're talking about. So in addition to the support that we receive from Catholics across the country to implement these programs, we also rely heavily on U.S. funding, U.S. government funding through the United States Agency for International Development and other departments, including the U.S. Department of Agriculture, for funding for programming that target people within these categories. And so this is a quick overview of food security legislation that touch on or that we actually tap into and utilize in some aspects of our work overseas. So Farm Bill, of course, this is our presentation on Farm Bill. Farm Bill is top on this list. In the Farm Bill, there are three main programs we're focusing on. There's a few other things besides this, but the three main programs we're focusing on in terms of our priorities for Farm Bill advocacy, as well as in the field, utilizing to help people, is the Food for Peace program, referred to as Title II sometimes, referred to as PL 480. This is essentially a commodity program where we're sending food overseas, either for an emergency to help address emergency conditions or to help support long-term development. McGovern-Dole and Food for Progress are also, they're much smaller programs, but still very important. McGovern-Dole deals with school feeding. Food for Progress has very specific objectives around connecting farmers to local and international value chains. I'll get into details on all three of these in just a moment, but just to round out the overview, in addition to the Farm Bill programs, the Global Food Security Act, which is actually also legislation that's pending before Congress now, authorizes a couple of other important pieces of the food security makeup of the federal government provides. Feed the Future, which is also development-oriented, and Emergency Food Security Program, which is emergency-oriented. In both cases, this is direct funding of programs as opposed to providing U.S. commodities. And then to wrap it all together, not just Feed the Future and EFSP here, but also the Farm Bill programs and programs outside of this list. The Global Food Security Act charges USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, with organizing and coordinating the work that's being done across federal agencies to support food security overseas. And so this Global Food Security Act and then the strategy that comes with it has been very important to make sure that we're, all the different programs are moving in the right direction, in the same direction, supporting each other. And then lastly, and this is something I'm sure folks know, annual appropriations. So the Farm Bill as well as the Global Food Security Act are authorization bills. These bills set out the rules and regs that each of these programs are supposed to follow. Annual appropriations is the yearly funding each of these programs end up getting. And this is a decision, again, that's made each year by Congress. The funding can go up and down, and so we need to be on top of that as well. And the two areas in particular that's important for appropriations in the international food security space is agriculture appropriations, which funds Food for Peace, Title II, McGovern-Dole, and then the state and foreign operations appropriations. This is the main international account, I guess, or international section of the annual appropriations bill. And in there are line items for development assistance, which is the primary source of funding for Feed the Future, and international disaster assistance, which is the primary source for funding for the Emergency Food Security Program. And I'll just take a moment to, between the Farm Bill and the Global Food Security Act programming, I just want to highlight, I'm going to go back to the earlier slide. So in this recover stage, and as we move up to the build, Food for Peace emergency commodities and the Emergency Food Security Program, so one of these programs in the Farm Bill, the other in the Global Food Security Act, are very important to us to be able to reach and provide emergency assistance to people who are in this recover area. Now, Food for Peace also has a development component, and that development component tends to be that bridge that brings people from recover to build. And so that's where that fits. Food for Peace development program, I'll certainly get into more details about that in a moment. That's where it fits into our model here, and an important stepping stone and going up the economic ladder for small farm families. And then Feed the Future tends to focus more on the build to grow sections, getting people up to that point where they are much closer to self-reliance. And so there is connections between all these different programs, and they're all important for us to support ultimately. And the Global Food Security Strategy is helping to make those connections clearer and sequencing better. So going into a little bit more detail on the Food for Peace part of the Farm Bill. As I mentioned earlier, there's an emergency section, there's a development section. It also actually funds the Farmer to Farmer program and the Famine Early Warning System. So in the emergency section, we really are talking about getting food from the U.S. out overseas to countries that are in acute need because of a drought, because of conflict, because of floods, storms, and people need that food literally to survive. In the development programs, we're talking about multi-year programs intended to move people from, essentially the edge, the very edge, the precipice of the abyss of poverty, into a point of closer to self-reliance. And CRS is currently implementing a number of those programs as well. One of the key parts of these programs is that they're multi-sectoral. They let us get into different areas within a community and work on different areas. So we're talking about ag production, we're talking about, but not just. We have to also focus on nutrition. We have to focus on connecting people to markets. We have to look at the overall landscape and watershed management and just water management generally. There's a lot of different pieces that ultimately go to the success or failure of these development-oriented programs. And one of the important things about Food for Peace is it does allow us to get into all those different sections of programming that basically reinforce one another to get us to the point of actually getting people out of poverty. And then Farmer to Farmer, it's a relatively small program, but important. It actually brings experts from the United States. Now, sometimes it's farmers, sometimes it's people outside of traditional just straight farming, but people with expertise that can support agriculture-oriented development. For instance, scientists working with local we can take scientists from the United States at a university or a government lab and take them overseas to work with governments or universities so that they can then provide support to their local farmers in more fuller capacity. Or we bring in folks who are experts at marketing, experts at developing value chains, connecting to international markets to help support these farmers. And so we plug in these farmer to farmer, and they're all volunteers, these farmer to farmer volunteers, experts from the United States, into our programs to give them that extra information, extra push to get them over particular challenges that they're facing. And then the Famine Early Warning System is a program that's run by the United States Agency for International Development that looks at about 40 different countries around the world, monitors them to see where things stand in terms of food security. They're looking at things like weather patterns and market prices for key staples to give us a sense, there's a good chance in 6 months that X country is going to be seeing a drought because we didn't get good rains this year. That's what this system does, and it gives us a heads up on where we need to concentrate resources, start positioning resources to respond to a likely emergency in 6 to 12 months out. So those are the key pieces in Food for Peace, but I think it's also helpful to get a picture of what this really means. And so I just want to run through a few slides here with pictures that actually show you what's happening. So these are from our programs that we're implementing on the emergency side of Food for Peace. Left one's in Ethiopia, right one's in South Sudan. Actually, in Ethiopia, we're leading a major food response to emergency conditions, drought conditions. The program itself is actually very flexible. It can increase or decrease very quickly the number of people served depending on the need. We had to bump it up to about 3 million people in 2016 during the El Nino drought. Normally, we're under 1 million people that we're serving in that particular program. And then in South Sudan, we're also, it's a bit of a challenge to get to some of the places because South Sudan, unfortunately, is in the middle of conflict, and so different areas of the country become very inaccessible because of the fighting. And so we airlift, and this actually was in partnership with the World Food Program, to airlift food into remote areas of South Sudan. I don't know, Catholic Relief Services is a major implementer of Food for Peace emergency programming, but by far, I think the World Food Program is the main recipient on the emergency side for Food for Peace, and that's something I think probably a lot of people are aware of. World Food Program, WFP, and so that's where they're actually getting a lot of funding from. On the development side of Food for Peace, one of the key areas that we're utilizing those resources for is landscape restoration. We're seeing, water runoff, poor management of lands, and frankly, climate variability impacting the poor farmers in very negative ways. When water, basically with deforestation, people are cutting down trees to, if you're really poor, you're basically going to find any way you can to make a living. In some cases, for the people in abject poverty, they're cutting down what trees there are to sell, the wood for firewood or turn it into charcoal. We've seen, unfortunately, as a result, deforestation in a lot of places. In addition to that, the climate variability, we're seeing, in a lot of cases where countries that would receive a certain amount of rainfall over the course of a month or two are seeing that rain actually come down in the course of 2 or 3 or 4 days. And then dry spells after that, and so the management of all that water coming through in such short time has been a real challenge. Always has been, in severe rains, but it's getting more so these days. And so what we're doing with the Food for Peace development programming is developing mechanisms, really, very rudimentary mechanisms that can be maintained by the people we're working with, utilizing just local resources. And we're having great results. So just to explain the picture from Malawi up top, that's the rainfall taking away the topsoil, basically, and eating into arable land, agricultural land. What we've been able to do with these different mechanisms, and we're talking about basically trenches for water to seep into the ground better, and the small little contour, small little dams that flow through the contour of hills, so that when the rain is coming down, the water is slowed, and it's not rushing down and taking off topsoil. So what we've been able to do with these types of interventions, you'll see in Niger and in Ethiopia. Niger in the background, those are sand dunes. That's the Sahara Desert essentially coming in. We've been able to reclaim sand dunes into what you see in the foreground there. This land isn't quite ready for agriculture, but it's on its way. On the Ethiopia side, you see two hills, one on the left, one on the right. The left has not been treated, the right has, with these types of interventions. You can see the greenery there. And what's happening in these cases is that the water is percolating more into the ground, and the water tables are rising. Streams that would dry up at some point in the year are now flowing year-round. The wells that are dug, we actually don't have to go as deep as we used to, because the water table is rising. And so that gives us an opportunity on the farm level to introduce irrigation farming to a lot of communities that they never had before because they didn't have water available to them. And that's what we see here in a picture in Ethiopia on the top left. But we're also doing a lot of other things on the farm. We know that the soil quality is poor in a lot of the places that we're a lot of the farm families we're working with. The farm families are working usually with very little land, a few acres at a time, for each family to try to build a living off of, and so they don't have time, or they don't have the opportunity to really fallow fields, which is, I think, the traditional practice here in the United States. Let a field rest for a year or two. They have to utilize the what land is available to them every year to the maximum extent possible, and so we need our objective is to introduce new techniques that will help. Replenish the nutrients in the soil, such as intercropping and introducing tree planting around and in fields, so that you can take the clippings from those trees and turn them into mulch and have that get more nutrients into the ground. And with these sort of techniques, we are improving the quality of the soil. And so what we're seeing here in the bottom right hand is a chart of some of the experience that we've seen. In this particular case, I think it was in Zambia, and in a lot of countries actually in Africa, maize is a primary staple crop. And so we have a test fields here with just maize. Then you have some intercropping in distinct rows, and then you have within row intercropping, and the differences in output that land is able to sustain in terms of the tonnage of maize crop in each of these years. We're seeing huge returns for those that are doing the intercropping right. In addition to that, food storage and post-harvest loss is a real problem, and so we're introducing various ideas and techniques there to improve food storage. Also, in the development programs, Food for Peace development programs, we're doing nutrition interventions. So we may be helping communities grow more food, but it's not necessarily resulting in better health outcomes for the people we're helping, unless we're focused on making sure that the food that is being produced is also being consumed by the people that are producing, as opposed to just sold for the market, and that there's dietary diversity. It's not just corn, for instance, that they're producing. And so we're helping to
Hello? Eric, did we lose you?
each of these farm families through.
Okay.
Still here.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. We're helping farm families diversify their diets by basically seed fairs that give them access to a variety of other seed besides the main staple crop. We're getting water into communities that have very difficult time getting clean water, because we know that clean water is important for keeping nutrients when people ingest them in their bodies. Diarrheal diseases are very common due to in the places we're working, due to the lack of clean water. And so there's a key component of making sure that people retain the nutrition that they eat by drinking clean water. And then there are places where malnutrition is really bad, and our objectives are to try to intervene, particularly for the kids, in the first 1,000 days, between conception and a child's second birthday. That's a critical time to really make sure the children have proper nutrition. That's a key period of brain development, physical development, and if you miss that window and the children have poor nutrition in that window, that they unfortunately will have lifetime impacts. Stunting is the term that's often used for folks for children that have poor nutrition in this period. our objective is to cut off and head off that stunting by making sure they have proper nutrition. Stunting is essentially a shorthand for saying that the children are going to grow up to be shorter. The cognitive abilities are going to be impaired as a result of the poor nutrition during those formative years. And then, I'm sorry, was there a question?
Yeah, I was just like, is it possible? I need to make sure we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to be sure.
Okay, I'll skip through. People have details here on the USDA programs they can read. I'll just run through real quick our CRS Farm Bill objectives on the international side. This is sort of the layout of what we're trying to do. It's maintaining the funding for the existing programs, and then expand the reach and efficiency of these programs. What we've seen between the House and Senate Farm Bill is a lot of good stuff, actually. Congress has come through keeping all these programs intact, and both the House and Senate bills have provisions in there that improve reach and efficiency of programs. And so these are the pieces that we're going to be focusing a lot of attention on going forward, particularly the things that are in the Senate Farm Bill that aren't in the House. We'd like to see actually ultimately picked up in the final version of the Farm Bill. And then, sort of immediate steps going forward. We know the Senate's going to be voting in the next couple of weeks. I think Andrew noted that they have some information that'll probably be next week. The House will probably actually bring back their Farm Bill next week as well. So next week will be very busy in getting these bills done. If there's an opportunity, we'd like to try to address through an amendment process an issue related to cargo preference, and that's getting the food requirements to put the food on U.S. ships when we send it from the U.S. to whatever country needs the assistance. The issue here is U.S. ships tend to be more expensive. And so a way to improve efficiency is to put more competition into this area and having U.S. ships compete against foreign ships to provide the service. And then lastly, again, we're probably pretty close to conference, and what we're hoping to do in that conference between the House and Senate Farm Bills is retain all the positive changes that we were able to secure. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Eric, very much. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and move on to Jim and let him give his presentation. And then if there are any questions, we'll save those to the end.
Okay. Now my presentation, can you see it?
Almost. Hang on. It should be coming. There it is. Yes, we can see it.
Great. Thank you. Again, Jim Ennis with Catholic Rural Life. We're a national organization. I just want to talk on a few things for you all in Ohio. The draft farm bill that was passed by the Senate Ag Committee yesterday, we just think it's a laudable effort compared to what we saw in the House because it includes a lot of much needed funding increases and also some critical policy improvements on key sustainable agriculture priorities. And I know in Ohio, agriculture is really significant, and also sustainable agriculture is a great need. I don't have time to cover all the points, but what I want to do is just talk to you about three areas: conservation, organic agriculture, and local foods and rural development. And just to let you know, the Farm Bill, 20%, approximately 20-25% of the Farm Bill goes to these agriculture and rural development programs, whereas the other 75 to 80% go to the food programs that were outlined in the first presentation around the SNAP program. But in the conservation component, this is regarding what came out of the Senate, three positive things. One, it incentivizes the adoption of key activities regarding what's called CSP, or Conservation Stewardship Program, and increases payment levels for cover crops, resource conserving crop rotations, and management intensive rotational grazing. These are all important practices within Ohio agriculture to protect soil and water resources. The bill also authorizes this conservation stewardship payment for financial and technical assistance to support the development of comprehensive conservation programs again, which are fundamental to reaching higher levels of stewardship, and also encourages the adoption of conservation activities within EQIP, which is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, as well as CSP. But what the bill doesn't do is that it cuts much needed funds from CSP and the EQIP program. These funds are repurposed to support other programs in the title, but we don't think that's a sustainable approach. And so we're concerned about that. Also, it proposed to reduce the permanent baseline conservation funding by $1.5 billion over the course of the Farm Bill, and so it weakens many of the nation's improvements in environmental laws. Around organic agriculture, the bill includes historic increase for the Organic Research Extension Initiative, which supports the research projects to address the most critical challenges faced by organic farmers. This is critical, for instance, at Ohio State University, that it provides support for research focused on organic and sustainable agriculture. It also restores the funding for the Organic Production and Market Data Initiative, a total of about $5 million in mandatory funding. And what this is important is this helps facilitate the collection and distribution of organic market information. And this helps a lot of the smaller farmers who are moving into organic agriculture, which is a growing category. Also, it renews funding for what's called the National Organic Certification Cost Share Program that the 2014 Farm Bill had, but just continues to support those who want to go into organic agriculture. Certification is expensive, and this helps, cost share programs help support it. What the bill doesn't do is that it cuts much needed funds from CSP and the EQIP, which I mentioned, excuse me, I went backwards. The bill fails to direct the U.S. Department of Agriculture to complete price elections for all covered crops, including organic crops, in 5 years. I don't want to get into the weeds, and no pun intended, but again, this is important. The bill fails, however, to also make any changes to the EQIP Organic Initiative, which would have improved the conservation support for organic producers. So these are a couple of concerns. Lastly, the local agriculture and regional rural development. I just want to highlight a few elements here. First of all, consumer demand for local and regional products is on the rise nationally. And what the bill does is creates a local agriculture market program and provides the funding per year around local market programs around the country. So it helps create that infrastructure of farmers being able to supply their local food chains. And you think that would be obvious, but the current food system is not incentivizing that way. And so the USDA has been looking at these local agriculture programs, and this Farm Bill would fund that. It also reauthorizes the Local and Regional Foods Act, which provides $50 million a year in mandatory permanent baseline funding. Again, that supports these local food programs. I want to reiterate here that Catholic Rural Life has a whole bunch of more detail on this on our website at catholicrurallife.org. What the bill also does is requires the USDA to have an undersecretary for rural development, overturning the decision that was made last year by the USDA to eliminate that. And you really need someone in leadership and funding to support these efforts. What the bill doesn't do, it fails to include additional mandatory funding for the USDA farm to school grants. A lot of these farm to school grants, which were in the 2014 bill, has helped support efforts around the country to provide food locally to those local schools. And it also reduces mandatory funding for the community food projects. Again, this is all about local rural development and building bridges between the rural and the urban centers. It also does not provide mandatory funding for or make important policy changes to improve food safety training program. And there's been a lot of outbreaks we know of, and this is a continued concern. But also it doesn't provide any mandatory funding for the rural micro entrepreneur loan program. 2014 Farm Bill provided a program with $3 million per year. It doesn't sound like much, but a lot of these local entrepreneurs need some capital and access to capital, and this funding provided some for that. And this current draft of the Farm Bill out of the Senate doesn't include that. That's the end of the presentation. What I'd like to do is just open up for questions if anyone has any, or for the other candidates too, for the other presenters.
Yeah. Jim, could you expand a little bit on the farm to school grants? Because I think that's something that might be of an impact for Catholic Charities in particular.
Yeah, let me just get back to that slide and then expand on that. So what I was talking about for funding for the year. So that's that we would be able to grow the program. And so there's the program has been highly successful and a lot of organizations interested in continuing to expand it, but it doesn't provide that additional mandatory funding. And so we're concerned that that we want to continue to encourage our members to talk to their legislators, especially those on the Agriculture Committee and so forth, to reconsider. We've been advocating on that. We have a coalition that we support and we participate in called the National Sustainable Ag Coalition that's been advocating on this behalf.
Okay, so is this farms providing food to, this is money, the grants would be money to farmers to be able to supply schools with fresh food?
Correct.
That is, okay.
Yeah.
And then what about the community food project as well? Is that something similar but going towards communities?
Yes, and this is again working with community food banks, community food projects, food hubs to create a infrastructure to support and provide local foods to communities.
Okay.
And you would think this is basic, but this is additional funding to continue to build bridges between small, mid-sized farmers. A lot of the smaller, mid-sized farmers aren't able to get into the system. And so this is mandatory funding for those community food project grants.
Okay, so is that under the community supplemental food program? Food assistance? There's so many different programs that trying to be able to figure out the ones that are connecting farmers with food banks, connecting farmers with different hunger programs, and because that's something that I know that we're definitely interested in knowing more about, because we can actually then tie that back into the work that we're doing here in Northeast Ohio. How are we able to let our legislators know that the farmers in Northeast Ohio that are their constituents benefit by helping provide food to schools and food banks that are also in their district, and that there's an important alliance there. So being able to kind of tie those two things together better.
Well, I can follow up with the group if you're, to get more on the detail of it and kind of the nuances here between the two, the additional mandatory funding for USDA farm schools and also the community food project grants. But right now it'd be no problem for me to get that for you.
Okay.
We have a lot of information on our website and on our coalition website.
What is the coalition website?
Well, Catholic Rural Life is catholicrurallife.org, and then the National Sustainable Ag Coalition is a partner.
Okay.
And so and in addition, we partner with Catholic Charities and CRS and the USCCB on advocating, but we have a sustainable ag partner too that is as a part of a large coalition of organizations promoting these particular programs that benefit local communities.
Okay. So yeah, I guess I need to follow up with you offline.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So are there any questions for Andrew, Eric, or Jim at this point? Hang on, here comes one. Question for Jim. If the House's more strict work requirements end up in the bill, what impact could that have on rural poor where there's less access to concentrations of job centers and job training programs?
Yeah, the worker restriction program is, we're happy that the House bill failed, because that would, it hurts workers in every community, but in rural communities, there are just so few options. And that that worker requirement increasing, that in some cases that the jobs just aren't available, or they're at part-time, and so that the increased worker requirement rules would impact the rural poor, especially just because they don't have the options that you might see in rural metro areas, and therefore it would put an undue burden and disqualify them from the nutrition's program.
Okay.
So it puts even more of a burden on those in rural communities.
Okay.
Greater.
All right. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. I have, while we're waiting, I have one more slide. So Jim, I'm going to take you off and put this back to me, which says Glenda, but it's really Diane. All right. Just to let you all know that there are some websites that we do have that we'd like to just kind of show you. Whoops, that went away. Get to that right slide. That we do, and this is for the benefit of the recording as well, for anybody that's watching this later, that we do have an issue page on our Engage website, and specifically focusing on the Farm Bill and some of the big priorities for the Catholic Church on that. We'll also have links to the Catholic Rural Life, to Catholic Charities USA, and CRS that you can see there, so that you can kind of follow up with what, as they're paying attention to the different legislation that's popping up, that you'll be able to kind of keep up with the day-to-day changes that are coming up with that. I also noticed that Poverty USA has a page on the Farm Bill as well that I think gives a good overview of the whole bill, of what is important, particularly for the Catholic Church and working with people in poverty and with farmers. You will be seeing action alerts coming out from us and connections to action alerts that are coming out from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, from Catholic Charities USA, and from CRS. So be looking out for those things, and hopefully today was able to give you a context of how we hope to proceed, and to be able to make a positive impact on legislation, especially as they get closer to September and really need to start working on having a solid bill to be voted on. So I want to thank you all very much for coming today. And if you don't have any more questions, I think we're good to go. Okay. Well, I hope everybody have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.